Every empire swears it's different. Every dominant power believes the rules don't apply to them. Rome thought their legions were eternal. Britain believed the sun would never set on their empire. The Soviet Union was convinced their system represented the future. They were all wrong, not because they were weak, but because they missed the signs of decline until it was too late to reverse. America in 2025 is making the same mistake. The patterns aren't hidden. They're screaming from every data set, every crumbling bridge, every overdose statistic. If you know where to look, you'll see that America isn't approaching decline. We're already in it. When Rome was rising, its roads were legendary. Perfectly engineered stone highways that connected every corner of the empire. Armies could march at speed, trade could flow freely, and the provinces stayed integrated with the capital. Those roads were more than infrastructure. They were proof that Rome worked, that the system could deliver, that the empire deserved its dominance. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, something had changed. The roads weren't being maintained. Bridges collapsed and weren't rebuilt. Aqueducts cracked and went unrepaired. Not because Romans forgot how to build, but because the state had lost the capacity to execute. The money was going to mercenary armies and palace intrigue instead of public works. By the time the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, its infrastructure had already been crumbling for generations. Now look at America. The interstate highway system built in the 1950s and 60s was our Roman road moment, an engineering marvel that connected the continent and powered economic growth for decades. But we haven't built anything comparable since. Instead, we're watching it fall apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives U.S. infrastructure a C-, not an A, not even passing. Bridges have weight restrictions. Dams are over a century old. Water systems poison cities like Flint. Electrical grids fail in storms. China has built 25,000 miles of high-speed rail since 2008. America has built zero, not because we lack technology or money, but because we've lost the state capacity to execute. Every project drowns in decades of reviews, local opposition, cost overruns, and political deadlock. California's high-speed rail started in 2008 and still hasn't connected major cities. The Big Dig took 15 years and cost 3 times the budget. These aren't anomalies. This is systemic decay. The Romans could see their roads crumbling, but convinced themselves it was temporary, a problem for the next emperor to solve. Americans look at collapsing bridges and assume someone else will fix it eventually. Both were wrong. When a civilization loses the ability to maintain the infrastructure that made it powerful, that's not a problem. That's a symptom. The empire is already dying. The infrastructure just makes it visible. In the late 19th century, Britain was the richest nation on earth. The empire covered a quarter of the globe. London was the financial capital of the world. British factories led the Industrial Revolution. On paper, everything looked magnificent, but underneath, British society was rotting. The wealth generated by empire and industry was concentrating in the hands of a tiny aristocratic elite, while workers lived in squalor. Victorian London had grand estates in Mayfair and festering slums in the East End. Children worked in coal mines. Life expectancy for the working class was decades shorter than for the rich. The empire was generating massive wealth, but ordinary Britons weren't seeing it. This concentration of wealth didn't just create moral problems, it created economic ones. When the middle and working classes are squeezed, they can't buy products, can't start businesses, can't invest in the future. The economy loses dynamism, social mobility freezes, and eventually the whole system becomes brittle. Britain's decline through the 20th century wasn't just about losing colonies, it was about an economy that had stopped working for most of its people long before the formal empire fell. America today is repeating this pattern with eerie precision. On paper, the economy looks healthy. Stock markets hit records. GDP grows. The wealth exists. But it's concentrating at the top at rates not seen since the Gilded Age. The median American household has seen virtually no income growth in 40 years when adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, the top 1% has captured the vast majority of economic gains. The American dream was based on a promise. Work hard and you'll do better than your parents. That promise is dead. Social mobility in America is now lower than in most of Europe. In the old aristocratic societies we supposedly transcended, if you're born poor in America, you're statistically likely to die poor. The meritocracy we celebrate is largely fiction, and just like Victorian Britain, this concentration isn't sustainable. When young people can't afford homes, when medical bankruptcy is common, when student debt crushes a generation, when gig economy jobs replace stable employment, that's not a vibrant economy. That's a system eating itself. Britain convinced itself that empire wealth meant everything was fine while its social fabric tore. America is making the same bet. History suggests it won't end differently. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it ran out of money or lost a war. It collapsed because its people stopped believing in it. By the 1980s, everyone in the USSR knew the system was a joke. The propaganda was obviously false. The stores were empty while party officials lived in luxury. The promises of communist prosperity rang hollow against the reality of stagnation and corruption. When institutions lose legitimacy, when citizens stop trusting that the system works for them, collapse can happen shockingly fast. In 1995, the Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower that seemed permanent. By 1991, it no longer existed, not destroyed by invasion, but by the evaporation of belief. When people stop thinking their country's institutions are legitimate, those institutions become hollow shells that can shatter from the slightest pressure. Now look at America's trust numbers. Only 20% of Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. That's down from 77% in 1964. Trust in Congress is even lower, often in the single digits. Trust in media, corporations, churches, schools, and even each other has cratered. We've become a nation of strangers who assume the worst about each other and the institutions that govern us. This isn't just a feelings problem. Social trust is the foundation that makes everything else work. When people trust institutions, they cooperate, invest in the future, and build together. When they don't, every policy becomes a battle. Every election becomes existential. Every disagreement becomes grounds for tribal warfare. Americans now view the opposing political party not as fellow citizens with different ideas, but as existential threats. Republicans and Democrats increasingly don't want their children marrying across party lines, don't want to live in the same neighborhoods, consume completely different media that tells completely different stories about reality itself. The Soviets thought their system was too big to fail, too powerful to collapse. They were shocked by how fast it happened once the legitimacy evaporated. Americans still believe our institutions are eternal, that the system is too strong to break. But institutions don't fail because they run out of power. They fail because people stop believing in them. And by that measure, American institutions are already in crisis. We just haven't admitted it yet. After World War I, Germany faced a crisis of meaning. The old empire was gone, the economy was destroyed by reparations and hyperinflation, and millions of men returned from war to find no jobs, no future, and no hope. The Weimar Republic tried to build democracy on these ruins, but underneath the surface, German society was rotting. Unemployment, poverty, and despair were epidemic. Veterans felt betrayed. The middle class was wiped out. Young people saw no path forward. Into this void came substances that numbed the pain. Morphine and cocaine use exploded. Germany in the 1920s had a drug crisis that mirrors America's opioid epidemic in unsettling ways. People weren't getting high for fun. They were medicating existential despair. The drugs were a symptom of a society that had stopped offering its people reasons to stay sober. We know what happened next. When a population is desperate, angry, and hopeless, they become vulnerable to demagogues offering simple solutions and external enemies to blame. Weimar's drug crisis was a preview of its political collapse. America's opioid epidemic tells the same story. Over 100,000 Americans now die from drug overdoses every year, more than from car accidents and gun violence combined. This isn't recreational drug use gone wrong. This is mass despair being medicated with substances that kill. The highest overdose rates are in regions that have been economically gutted. Former manufacturing towns where the factory closed, the young people left, and nothing replaced them. These are communities where the future disappeared, and people decided oblivion was preferable to slow decline. Pharmaceutical companies lied about addiction risk and bribed doctors to prescribe. When people became addicted, the medical system abandoned them. Pills became expensive, so people switched to heroin. Then fentanyl entered the supply, and the death rate exploded. But the crisis isn't really about pills or chemistry. It's about why so many Americans want to stop feeling. Weimar Germans reached for morphine because their society had failed them. Americans reach for fentanyl for the same reason. We've normalized 100,000 deaths per year the same way we've normalized mass shootings and medical bankruptcies, as if these are natural features of reality rather than symptoms of systemic failure. Weimar's drug epidemic was a warning sign that German society was coming apart at the seams. No one listened. They treated it as a law enforcement problem instead of a civilizational crisis. We're making the same mistake, the Ottoman stagnation. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was a center of learning. Islamic scholars preserved and advanced Greek knowledge while Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages. Ottoman universities taught medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. The empire produced innovations in military technology, architecture, and administration that made it a superpower. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, something had broken. While Europe experienced the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, the Ottoman Empire turned inward. Religious conservatives gained power and pushed back against secular learning. Education stagnated. The madrasas taught religious texts, but not the practical sciences that were revolutionizing warfare and industry in the West. By the time Ottoman leaders realized they'd fallen behind, the gap was too large to close. They couldn't match European military technology because they lacked the educational foundation to produce engineers and scientists at scale. The empire didn't fall because it was conquered outright. It fell because it couldn't compete. It became the sick man of Europe, carved up by powers that had invested in education while the Ottomans rested on past glory. By World War I, the Ottoman Empire was a hollow shell. It collapsed not with a bang, but with a whimper, partitioned by nations whose schools had produced the scientists and engineers that now dominated the modern world. America's education system is following the Ottoman trajectory. For decades, American universities were the envy of the world. They still attract international students, but the foundation is cracking. Public universities that once provided affordable pathways to the middle class now cost tens of thousands per year. Student debt has exploded past $1.7 trillion, crushing an entire generation's ability to build wealth. And what are students getting? Often degrees that don't lead to jobs that can pay off the loans. But the crisis goes deeper than college costs. American K-12 education is mediocre by international standards. On global tests, American students rank around 25th in math and science, behind countries like Estonia and Poland. Wealthy families can buy excellent education through private schools or wealthy suburban districts. But for everyone else, public schools are understaffed, underfunded, and overwhelmed. Teachers are leaving in record numbers, driven out by low pay and impossible demands. The Ottomans convinced themselves they were still great while their schools fell behind. By the time they realized the mistake, Europe had already leaped ahead. America is doing the same thing, celebrating past achievements while producing a generation less educated than their parents. China graduates 4 times as many engineers as America. India is building technical talent at scale. The countries that dominate the 21st century will be the ones investing in education today. America's cutting it. When the Ottomans fell, no one invaded Constantinople and burned it down. The empire just became irrelevant, bypassed by nations that could do things the Ottomans no longer could. That's the future America is building. Not dramatic collapse, but slow irrelevance as other nations produce the scientists, engineers, and innovators that shape the modern world. 16th century Spain was the superpower of its age. Gold and silver poured in from American colonies. Spanish armies were the most feared in Europe. The Spanish Empire stretched across the globe. From the outside, Spain looked invincible. But the wealth was a curse disguised as a blessing. Instead of investing in productive industries, Spain consumed. The gold paid for imports rather than building domestic capacity. When you can buy everything with colonial wealth, why bother making things yourself? Spanish manufacturing withered. The empire became dependent on other nations for goods it could have produced. And when the colonial wealth eventually slowed, Spain discovered it had no economic foundation to fall back on. The empire had become a parasite on its own colonies. And when that relationship shifted, Spanish power evaporated. By the 18th century, Spain was a secondary power, militarily and economically eclipsed by nations that had built actual productive economies. The gold had bought temporary glory but long-term weakness. Spain's decline wasn't caused by losing battles. It was caused by a fundamentally hollow economy that looked rich but couldn't produce. America's economy increasingly resembles imperial Spain's. Impressive on paper, hollow underneath. We're the richest country on earth, but what do we actually make anymore? Manufacturing has been gutted and shipped overseas. Entire regions that once built things now wait for Amazon deliveries of goods made in China. We have a massive service economy and a sophisticated financial sector, but we've lost the capacity to produce the physical things that matter. When COVID hit and exposed supply chain fragility, Americans discovered we couldn't make our own masks, our own pharmaceuticals, our own semiconductors. We'd outsourced so much productive capacity that we were dependent on other nations for basics. That's not strength. That's Spain buying from Dutch and English merchants with colonial gold while its own workshops closed. And like Spain, America's current wealth is increasingly based on financial engineering rather than production. We trade stocks, charge fees, and manipulate money. Meanwhile, China builds factories, chips, batteries, and solar panels. The actual things that matter in the physical world are increasingly made elsewhere while America specializes in abstraction. Spain thought colonial wealth meant they'd won. They failed to notice that productive capacity matters more than gold. By the time they realized it, the Dutch and English had built economies that could outproduce and outcompete them. America is making the same error, assuming financial dominance means we don't need to make things. History suggests otherwise. Victorian Britain had the best medicine in the world, if you could afford it. London hospitals pioneered surgical techniques and disease treatment. British doctors were at the forefront of medical science. But the average British worker had no access to any of it. Healthcare was for the wealthy. Everyone else suffered and died from preventable diseases. This wasn't just cruel, it was stupid. When your working population is sick, productivity falls. When children die from preventable diseases, you lose future workers. When people can't afford treatment, conditions that should be minor become disabling. Britain's failure to provide health care to its working class weakened the empire even as its elite enjoyed the best medicine money could buy. America has recreated this Victorian system with modern characteristics. We spend more on healthcare per capita than any nation on earth, over $12,000 per person per year. And what do we get for that spending? Americans live shorter lives than people in Chile, Slovenia, and Costa Rica. American infant mortality is higher than in Cuba. Maternal mortality in America is rising while it falls everywhere else in the developed world. A pregnant American woman is more likely to die in childbirth than a pregnant woman in Kazakhstan. The money is there. The technology exists. But the system doesn't deliver. Instead, it extracts. Medical bankruptcy is uniquely American. Rationing insulin is uniquely American. People dying because they can't afford treatment is uniquely American among developed nations. We've created a healthcare system that works beautifully for the wealthy and fails catastrophically for everyone else, exactly like Victorian Britain. And just like Victorian Britain, this isn't sustainable. When your population is stressed, sick, and dying younger, that weakens everything. Life expectancy in America peaked in 2014 and has been falling since, not during COVID, before it. This is a long-term trend in the richest country in history. People are literally dying younger because the system has decided their health isn't worth the cost of providing universal care. Britain eventually built the NHS after World War II, recognizing that a healthy population is a national asset. America is going the opposite direction, making healthcare more expensive and less accessible, even as outcomes worsen. We're choosing the Victorian model in the 21st century. History tells us exactly where that leads. The pattern across all these examples is identical. Empires don't collapse dramatically. They decay gradually while insisting everything is fine. Romans watched their infrastructure crumble and assumed someone else would fix it. Britain concentrated wealth at the top and told itself empire would last forever. The Soviets lost legitimacy slowly and then collapsed suddenly. Weimar Germans medicated despair instead of addressing its causes. The Ottomans let education stagnate and became irrelevant. Spain consumed its wealth instead of building productive capacity. Victorian Britain let its working class die from preventable diseases and wondered why the empire felt brittle. America is following every one of these patterns simultaneously. Our infrastructure is crumbling like Rome's roads. Our wealth is concentrating like Victorian Britain. Our institutions have lost legitimacy like the Soviet Union. Our people are medicating despair like Weimar Germany. Our education is stagnating like the Ottoman Empire. Our economy is becoming hollow like Imperial Spain. Our healthcare is killing us like it killed Victorian workers. The signs aren't subtle, they're screaming. But just like every declining empire before us, we're invested in denial. We tell ourselves America is exceptional, that the rules don't apply to us, that we're too powerful to fail. Every dying empire told itself the same thing. Here's what history teaches. Decline isn't a moment, it's a process, and we're already in it. The infrastructure is already crumbling. The wealth is already concentrating. The institutions have already lost legitimacy. The despair is already epidemic. The education is already failing. The economy is already hollowing out. The healthcare is already killing us. These aren't future threats. They're current reality. The question isn't whether America is dying. The patterns answer that clearly. The question is whether you're willing to see it while there's still time to adapt, or whether you'll keep trusting the same institutions that led every empire before us over the cliff. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, America is reciting poetry that's been performed countless times before. The ending doesn't change, just because we wish it would. If you want to survive what's coming, stop believing the empire is eternal and start preparing for the world where it isn't. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here. And they can't hide it unless you refuse to look.